Good morning. My talk today regards those little letters that you see up on your screen when you type something in on your keyboard, and some interesting aspects of their past, of their history, and perhaps a glimpse into their future. Please raise your hand if you're familiar with the terms serif and sans serif. Whoa, good group. And please raise your hand if you know the word font. And I think we have just about everybody. And by the way, I will be using the terms font and typeface interchangeably today. 30 years ago, very few hands would have gone up in response to those questions. The 1990s featured several cultural developments that could be all filed under the term grunge. And the grunge effect did not overpass the world of typography. A minute ago, we saw two grunge fonts from that era. And what we're seeing right now are two magazine covers from a closely related phenomenon known as deconstructionist design. My response to both these trends now is about the same as it was then. I didn't think that grunge typography and deconstructionist design would have much of an effect on my career, but it wasn't long until some of my students were putting up work on the board in my class that looked like this, that looked like those magazine covers. Over my objections, they explained that they were merely representative of current state-of-the-art graphic design. Well, that thought bothered me a good bit, but not as much as later in the year when the Type Directors Club, an organization that I have always trusted to represent excellence in typography, included a lot of this work and honored a lot of this work in its annual publication. That troubled me so much that I began to wonder if it was really worth teaching anymore. Grasping at a handy straw, I reminded myself that this too shall pass. But it wasn't passing quickly enough for me. It clearly had something to do with the introduction of the computer into the world of graphic design. And it did not look like the computer was a passing fad. It seems that whenever there's a major change in the cultural development, in the technological development of a new approach to typography, that it's attended by three very closely related phenomena. First, there's a great increase in the public's awareness of typography, as your responses to my earlier requests would indicate. Second, there's a great influx of entrepreneurs eager to jump in on the ground floor of an exciting new technology. And third, there's the production of a lot of lunatic typefaces created out of great enthusiasm for the freedoms that the new technology has wrought, but created without a great sense of readability or aesthetics. The eras in which these events occur are represented on this timeline by the elevated areas of green. And just to get you squared away here, we have at the far left-hand end Johann Gutenberg inventing type in 1455, one of the factors that helped kick off the Renaissance. In the middle, we have this big hump, this century-long hump called the Industrial Revolution, when we also find the beginning of advertising. A little blip in the 1950s, which I'll be telling you more about in a little while. And then, of course, at the far right, there's the huge mountain of the digital revolution, which apparently we're still in the middle of. To get you better oriented, I'll tell you that over a period of 3,000 to 4,000 years, the alphabet made its way from its hieroglyphic beginnings counterclockwise around the Eastern Mediterranean, and finally coming to rest in Rome in about 500 BC. By 75 BC, the Romans had perfected the aesthetics of their letter forms to the point that it was appropriate to engrave them on parts of their beautifully proportioned architecture. The Roman Empire spread, among other places, into Northern and Western Europe, carrying its alphabet and its letter forms with it, where they blended with local approaches to handwriting and calligraphy. But several hundred years later, the Roman Empire receded, and those local hybrids got the chance to become increasingly idiosyncratic, to the point that in the 1400s, German scribes and monks were creating documents that looked like this, using a lettering style called Gothic black letter. So when Gutenberg designed his first font, in order to ease the transition for his readers, he patterned it after that style. You may have heard the bit of humor that has certain nationalities occupying certain roles in society. And within that vein, it's all well and good for the Germans to invent a new technology. But for primo aesthetics, you really need to scoot south about 500 miles to northern Italy, where in the 1400s, several French printers had set up shop. News of movable type and the printing press that Gutenberg had invented traveled fast. And one of those French printers, Nicholas Jensen, inspired not by Gothic black letter at all, but by the beautiful letter forms that he saw around him on the Roman buildings, created this typeface within 20 years of Gutenberg's black letter. And as we now know, this approach to type design has proven more successful in the long run. Printed books greatly helped the spread of literacy, and the newly literate were eager to learn about the world around them. So for the next couple of hundred years, virtually all the type that was set for books of serious purpose: historical, geographical, religious, scientific, and literary education. Now let's fast forward about 300 years and say hello to the Industrial Revolution. This was an era in which manual methods of production were replaced by mechanical methods. Suddenly, all kinds of things could be produced in much shorter periods of time and in much greater numbers than had ever been the case before. I like to use the examples of shoes. Before the Industrial Revolution, shoes were made one pair at a time by a shoemaker. And I would imagine that most people owned one or two pair of shoes. But once shoes could be produced in the hundreds, suddenly supply shot way out in front of demand. So demand had to be raised. You could write a book detailing at great length all the terrific reasons why everyone should own several pairs of shoes, but that might not be the most efficient way to go. Perhaps a shorter, more direct, and even emotional appeal would work better. And thus was advertising invented. Your customers may not come looking for your message about the upcoming styles. In order to reach them, you're going to have to go out and interrupt them in the middle of their day. A good way to do that would be to print and paste large posters with big type on fences and the sides of buildings. For the past 300 years, pieces of type had been small, so that many words could fit on the page of a book that you could hold in your hand. But when one piece of type could be 2 or 3 feet high, it would be nice if it weren't made out of lead, as type had always been. So here's what happens when one of these technological revolutions comes along. The type itself becomes lighter, and the processes involved become cheaper and faster. And this is why all those entrepreneurs come rushing to jump into the industry. It's not only an exciting time to do so, but it can be done with a much smaller investment than had ever been the case before. They continued to set small type text out of lead. And you can see by the horizontal strips across this printer's setup for a poster, those are the lines of small type. But for the larger type, what we call display type, they began to make letters out of wood. It was easier to cut and mill wood than it is to mine and cast lead. There were fewer steps in the process, and it could be managed by someone whose experience was less specialized. Wood type was set for display typography throughout the 19th and most of the 20th century. But in the 1950s, and here's that little blip I referred to, in the 1950s, another lighter, cheaper, faster approach to setting display type came along. Using photography, letters could be produced on film and paper. Not only lighter, cheaper, and faster, but words could now be printed at any size, no longer constrained by the physicality of wood and lead. The phototype era was comparatively short-lived. Photocomposition of text type was well underway by the mid-70s, driven by computers. But in 20 years after that, we were all setting our own type on our own computers, and all the type shops had closed their doors forever. Before I wrap this up, there's one fact that's been lurking in the shadows of this topic. What happens in those lengthy periods of time between the technological revolutions, where it looks like nothing's happening on this chart, on this timeline? But in fact, what is going on during these apparently quiet years is that serious and dedicated type designers who are not being rushed on by the urgency of a current revolution. And these designers are far more interested in excellence in typography than in creating a big splash with something new that may fizzle out in a few years. They design their typefaces in this era, and even more importantly, take the time to refine them to the point that we, in centuries and decades later, think of these fonts as classics. Can anybody call out the name of a typeface they consider to be a classic? Arial? It's on a different chart. Helvetica. Let's have another one or two. Time will tell. So far I've heard Helvetica. Any others? Palatino? What was it? Cheltenham? I'm going to go with that. And you can see these typefaces and other classics. Helvetica 1957 on the far right. I think somebody said Cheltenham 1896 on the downside of that century of wood type. And what was the other one? Oh, Garamond. Somebody said Garamond, which is at the far left in 1621. So it's during these eras that the classics get produced, and we get to use those typefaces for a good long time afterwards. What I had been looking for when I began this historical quest was some pattern that might assure me that the egregious excesses of those enthusiastic and rebellious young computer jockeys would indeed turn out to be only temporary. And I had found a pattern, at least to the point of identifying the rise and fall of various typographic technologies. But did any of those earlier revolutions also produce a bunch of lunatic typefaces, as this reminder of the grunge fonts in the 1990s will remind you? Moving backwards in time, let's take a look at a couple of the typefaces that were created for photo typesetting in the era of hippies and psychedelic drugs and groovy vibes. You may be able to discern some groovy vibes in the design of these typefaces. So the pattern looked like it was working. Oh no, too soon. The 19th century was an era in which the United States got bigger and pushier and more insistent on getting whatever it wanted. But as you look at these three typefaces, maybe you can see some of those characteristics reflected in the display fonts. In fact, I can add that you probably, from where you're sitting, can't even see any lowercase letters. In fact, they are the text, the little strips of gray probably that are snuck in between the lines of bigger type here. In fact, very, very few of the display type wood fonts that were created in the 19th century had lowercase letters at all. But I really couldn't be certain of the usefulness of the pattern I was discovering until I felt that I had really investigated whatever went down in the early years of the first type revolution. History did surprise me here, but it did not let me down. These three fonts were created within 10 years of Gutenberg's blackletter, and one would have to think that they must have been used at least once for something, for some purpose or other. So it was true. This too shall pass. The upshot of my research has been that I've been able to share this timeline with my students so that they can understand that I need to teach principles of typography that have nothing to do with whatever current fad may be in vogue. So can I predict anything about the future of typography? This image may give a hint as to some type technology that may not be too far in the future. At least I'm still in it. That's me and Photoshop. But whether or not that prediction turns out to be accurate or not, I'm confident that by the year 2050, the visual representation of language will be lighter, cheaper, and faster. Thank you.